So, of course, everyone is talking about what Mamdani's victory yesterday means. And the danger is to overgeneralize because we're just talking about one political victory. But it does feel like a seismic moment in American politics. So, just dismissing it also is a danger. So let's try to see what we can learn from this on a in a more general sense. So obviously, we're talking about New York, which is a very unique city. It has a lot of very different characteristics to other parts of the country, and we need to take that into account. We're talking about a much more progressive city than most, and there's a danger that what worked there for the Democratic Party could not work elsewhere. But when we're talking about the Middle East ramifications of this, or the Middle East policy ramifications for this, New York actually stands out as a what we would call a critical case in social sciences, something that you can get a much wider picture from, because we're talking about what has traditionally been the center of pro-Israel activism in the United States, where you have all the marches for Israel, where it was believed that if you didn't support Israel, you couldn't get elected. And we also had Zionist activists of various kinds turn this into a test case for Zionism, putting this in the center of an election where it didn't have to be, turning it into a referendum on it in a way. And of course, that backfired greatly. There was really an attempt to say that if you care about local issues more than you care about the Middle East, you're anti-Semitic, and that backfired. This kind of emotional blackmail spectacularly backfired. And the involvement of pro-Israeli forces so heavily for Cuomo, people who are influencers, who met with Netanyahu, people like Bill Ackman, people like Rappaport, who obsessed about this race, only seem to drive more voters towards Mamdani. So it really looks like the age of APAC and the pro-Israel consensus is over, because even in New York, that doesn't fly anymore. And that doesn't mean that every pro-Israeli candidate is going to lose necessarily, but it means it's no longer a prerequisite for being elected. And that's basically what APAC tried to create. They tried to create that sense that um, if you don't play ball, you're going to lose. And that meant that candidates who didn't really care all that much about Israel were forced into taking very concrete steps to show their support for Israel. I don't think that's something that candidates are going to do anymore. And that could change everything regarding policy towards Israel. Now, on a less Middle East focused level, because after all, this is a New York mayoral race and not the Tel Aviv mayoral race. We're seeing something that should have been obvious to the Democrats for a long time, but hasn't been, mostly because of the influence of big donors. And that is the fact that defending the status quo in America is a losing battle. Um, there is such a strong sense in the country that there's injustice, that there is inequality, that the deck is loaded against justice, that anyone who defends that status quo is going to be unpopular with most people. Most people are getting screwed over by the system. Sure, you can get donors if you defend the status quo because the people who are enjoying the status quo want to reinforce it. But we're still living in a democracy. They're the minority of the people. And no matter how much money you throw at people, you can't convince them that the system isn't screwing them over when it has been so spectacularly for so long. So Cuomo came off as the institutional status quo candidate, and accordingly, he lost. And anyone who comes off like that is likely to lose. And that is particularly true with young voters. And speaking of young voters, that was the real revelation, I think, with this election, is how strongly young voters broke for Mamdani, especially young males. Now, there's been a sort of a sense, maybe a myth, that young males, especially young white males, are turning sort of irreversibly right wing or fascist. And there's a lot of truth to that. But the fact that the vast majority of them in New York voted for Mamdani shows that it's not really about them being racist. It truly is, at least now, about economic anxiety. We have a younger generation that is being replaced by AI in their entry level jobs, trying desperately to survive in the gig economy, and deeply stressed by rising rent and rising cost of living more generally. And the status quo is working against them. So whoever represents it is not going to get their votes. And this is an opportunity for the Democratic Party to blunt some of the elements that have been giving this push to fascism, to racism, by offering a economic horizon, one that's based on more equitable distribution of wealth, and that goes against the agenda of billionaires. And Mamdani did that. That is translatable to other cities. Of course, it would have to be done differently. Some of the other things that Mamdani embraced, very strong elements of multiculturalism, that might not work elsewhere. But I think the fact that he put such an emphasis on economic elements is really timely, important, and there's a lot that we can learn from that. And we learned something about the American electorate yesterday, which is that really there's just an economic bottom line for them. They don't vote on democracy, they don't vote on race, they don't vote on transgender issues. What matters to them ultimately is cost of living and the bottom line. And the more universal and economic the message that Democrats can send, the better they will do. So we're talking about a whole new era. And the more the Democrats continue to hold on to old policies that back the corporate structure, the longer it will take them to get back into power. Because the GOP has ridden into power just on the illusion that they're fighting for the little guy using various cultural motifs and that they would lower the cost of living. If Democrats can actually turn that into an actionable agenda, then they're going to have an electoral juggernaut on their hands.